Chaos in Cuba. Thousands rally against the government in the biggest protests in decades. Havana blames foreign agitators, but demonstrators say they're fighting for freedom. Also ahead on the program, Haiti's precarious future, with around 24 suspects in custody accused of assassinating the president. A motive is still unclear. As political opponents vie to fill the power vacuum, what can prevent Haiti from descending into anarchy? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Public dissent in Cuba is extremely rare, but thousands have rallied across the country in some of the biggest protests since the 1990s. Demonstrators raged against the crumbling economy, high food prices, and what they see as the government's failed response to the coronavirus pandemic. The virus is still spreading rapidly, and travel restrictions have led to a dramatic fall in tourism. Protesters are demanding President Miguel Diaz-Canel resign, but instead he's called on his own supporters to take to the streets and fight back. During an impassioned speech to the nation, the communist leader blamed Washington for his country's woes, demanding the U.S. government lift sanctions.
Is it not very hypocritical and cynical that you block me? That you, who carry out the policy that violates the human rights of an entire people for more than 60 years, intensify it in the midst of a situation as complex as the pandemic, and you want to present yourself as the big savior? Lift the blockade, lift the 243 measures, and we will see how we get along. And then we will see what these people who have achieved an immense social work despite a nearly subordinated, nearly a war economy due to these measures is capable of. What are they afraid of? Cuba's example? What Cuba can do in other situations with more economic possibilities?
Well, to talk more about the discontent in Cuba, I'm joined from New York by John Kavulich, president of the US-Cuba Trade and Economic Council. And from Paris is Collin Laverty. He is the president of Cuba Educational Travel and a senior partner at Havana Strategies. That's a consulting firm for businesses in Cuba. Thanks so much both for being with us. Collin, I'm going to start with you and tell us what's actually happening here. I mean, is this a manifestation of kind of general frustration with a struggling economy and, a lack of services, or is there something more revolutionary to it with, also foreign forces working behind the scenes as the government suspects?
Well, I think there's a combination of factors. We've seen across the world, and particularly in Latin America, the economic impact of coronavirus, and there's no exception on the Cuban side. So there's a series of problems and economic struggles, daily life issues that have arisen and intensified during COVID. There's also, the Trump administration was very clear about trying to intensify and successfully intensifying sanctions with the intention of basically starving the people and bringing them out into the streets, which has been the objective of U.S. policy for 6 decades now. So all of those things led to the situation that Cuba's facing right now. I'd say, it does go beyond that. I think there's a lot of pent-up frustration amongst Cubans, not only with the current situation they've been facing since the Trump sanctions and since the coronavirus pandemic, but in their eyes, a failure by the Cuban government to make economic and political reforms that would make life better for them at the moment, but prior to the last few years, just over time. And so it's a combination of all those factors. Is the U.S. To blame to some extent? Yes. This is the expressed intention of U.S. policy to bring people out to the streets and topple the government, and that's what the Trump administration intended to do. The Biden administration kept that policy in place, and this is the result.
Okay, John, is Trump now seeing what he set out to do?
In part. You have now somewhat of a symbiotic relationship between President Diaz-Canel in Havana and President Biden in Washington. President Diaz-Canel needs to show his people empathy, but the Communist Party needs to show strength. And in Washington, President Biden needs to show empathy, and the Democratic Party needs to show strength because it's under attack from the Republican Party. The overall, challenge here for both governments is that the Cuban government looks at the U.S. sanctions as a tool and one that can be constructive. And so, it's not necessarily, you know, counterintuitive to believe that the Cuban government look at what's happened and says, all right, if this can move forward the Biden administration timeline to complete its Cuba policy review, which has been under review for 6 months, if this can push that timetable, there's not much more that Biden can do negatively. So the Diaz-Canel administration looks at it's a bet that if they allow some of the demonstrations to take place, and if the pressure from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is to push the Biden administration to move forward its review and implement it, then they figure we can make something better out of it. I mean, it's a gamble, but they figure they can survive this, and they're likely correct.
Collin, let me get your take on that. I mean, but why hasn't President Biden just done what Obama really set out to do and at least leave Trump-era policy behind and just reverse what he stood against over the 4 years of Trump's administration?
Well, it's pretty clear. He didn't do as well in South Florida as he would have liked, and they've attributed that to a shift amongst the Cuban American community back to the hardline policies that the Trump administration put in place. So he's kind of trying to mimic Trump on it. I don't think he understands that those hardline Miami exiles are never going to support him. Anyways, there's another factor in terms of Cuban American members of Congress, one who's particularly influential in Bob Menendez from New Jersey, who's a Democrat and is kind of has been strongholding the administration, holding other policies hostage to make sure that they don't do anything on Cuba. But what the Biden administration has learned, and many previous administrations have learned, when you treat a foreign policy issue like Cuba, particularly the fact that it's 90 miles off the coast, as a domestic policy issue rather than a foreign policy issue, it can often come back to bite you in the form of a crisis. And this has gone from something they've continuously said is not a priority for them, looking at votes in South Florida and thinking about the midterms and the next presidential election. And unfortunately, we're now in a situation where it's a crisis, where it's going to require a lot of their thinking at the level of the White House and the NSC. And there's going to be political ramifications regardless of how they deal with it. I urge them to look at it through a humanitarian lens and through a national security lens. This is a very critical situation, and we don't know which way it's going to go, and it could go worse. And if the Biden administration continues to address this through a South Florida votes lens, this thing could get much worse than it is right now.
John, are you on the same page there?
I don't believe that what took place on Sunday in Cuba, and meaning not just Havana, but throughout Cuba, rises to the level of a crisis for the United States, and specifically for the Biden administration. The relationship between the US and Cuba's relationship with itself, has always been about a series of moments. It's never been about a moment. And what happened on Sunday is a moment, but not the moment. And I think we'll watch what happens next Sunday. Will there be a repeat? Will it be the same? What will the Cuban government's response be? And for the Biden administration, and for every president, it shouldn't shock anyone that every decision relating to a foreign country has a context of domestic politics. And the Biden administration is doing what others have done, which is Cuba is a domestic policy issue. It's going to remain that. And for the Biden administration, this is about 2021, elections in 22, elections in 24. And we have a lot of elections within the area, Venezuela, Brazil, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, that are all coming in the next 3 years. So the Biden administration is looking at everything in terms of that election cycle lens.
Okay. Collin, if we can then talk about what's really happening on the ground inside Cuba. And as John referred to, he thinks these are moments. And there was also a moment back in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, where people actually took to the streets. We've said repeatedly these are the biggest protests we've seen since then. So since then, though, Cubans have been able to see foreign investment actually come in. I mean, I was shocked, actually, when I returned to Cuba after 20 years and saw luxury hotels that I'd never seen before. There were bars with expensive cocktails catering to wealthier Cubans as well as foreigners. And you started to get a sense of frustration for other Cubans who felt like, wait a minute, why aren't we getting a piece of this growth? Do you think there's a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about how that growth happens? They say it's the government being able to build these big hotels when it's really not. It's foreign investment that's coming in independently of the poverty in Cuba and capitalizing on what's there in the tourism industry. And ordinary Cubans are left frustrated just having to witness it.
Well, just on the first point about, moments and comparing what's happened, I wouldn't say just Sunday. This is still happening today. Compared to what happened in 1994, this is much more significant, both in what happened, the size and the locations of these demonstrations, the police response. I mean, there were shots fired. We don't know because internet's down, but the level of violence, the magnitude of these protests, and there's new factors in terms of internet access. There's more Cubans that live off the island but travel back and forth. There's more access to information. There's probably not the same level of economic necessity, but in terms of politics and social factors, it's a very different social fabric and political and cultural landscape. So this is a very different moment, and it's very significant. In terms of Cuba's development over the years, there's definitely frustration amongst Cubans about, the political and economic policy making. I will say, if you talk to Cubans, the overwhelming majority will refer to the Obama years as the glory years, when you saw not only foreign investment at a high level coming in from foreign companies to the Cuban government, but you saw an expansion of the private sector, you saw an expansion of Americans traveling, and there was widespread growth, kind of the start to a building of a middle class through a policy of engagement. And unfortunately, the Trump administration ended that. And also the Cuban government stopped making much needed reforms that were expanding the private sector, expanding civil liberties for Cubans, and giving Cubans a sense of there is a path forward and our country is changing. And the combination of those two things, of the U.S. turning its back on the Cuban people and the Cuban government stopping this process of giving hope to the Cuban people, those are the two processes and the two elements that have really left, Cubans struggling. And then you put COVID and everything COVID brings to the table, and that's what led to this pressure cooker that just boiled over. And I'll repeat, I mean, this is not over. This is very scary. There's a lot of tension, and it's not clear how far this thing is going to go.
Okay. Collin thinks it's not clear. John, what do you think? Do you have an idea of what needs to happen now for Cuba to get better and stabilize?
The history of the Cuban government has been, when it's in a corner, it will make changes with just enough elasticity to get them through whatever they feel the crisis is to the next crisis. And then they'll look back and say, what can we remove that we allowed that we really didn't like? Over the last 5 years, that elasticity has lessened, that distance has lessened. So the Cuban government doesn't have as many options to claw something back once they allow it. And what Collin said in terms of recently, whether it's the merging of the currency in January, which was painful and will continue to be so, or allowing more access and more presence for small and medium-sized enterprises, Cuban government doesn't necessarily want to do it, but it's going to do it. I think also you're going to see, President Diaz-Canel look to what the Cuban people want immediately, and you're going to see, some activity with the Cuban government allowing those doors to open.
Okay.
We'll see how much, though, will remain once this is over.
John, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both my panelists really so much for being with us. Now, events in Haiti are unfolding like a Hollywood thriller, but the crisis is very real and it is far from entertaining. A power vacuum threatens the stability of the Caribbean nation. Several arrests have now been made in connection with the assassination of President Jovenel Moise. He was gunned down at his home last week. Haitian police believe those responsible are Colombian mercenaries hired by a Haitian-American doctor who lives in Florida. Christian Emmanuel Sanon is accused of plotting Moise's murder in a bid to seize power, though some doubt he would have the financing to carry out such an operation. Haiti is a nation in crisis. Escalating gang violence is forcing Haitians to stay home while politicians vie for power. First to claim control of the nation was acting Prime Minister Claude Joseph, soon followed by Senate President Joseph Lambert, as well as Prime Minister-designate Ariel Henry. And the interim government has now controversially asked the United States to send troops to stabilize the country. But is that really the answer? Well, let's ask our panel. And joining me now from the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince, is journalist and civil society activist Monique Clesca. And from New York, editor of the weekly newspaper Haiti Liberté, Kim Ives. Thanks both so much for being with us. Kim, I'll start with you. Before we get into the government's call for foreign intervention, I want to ask you if you think Haiti is any closer to really knowing who assassinated Jovenel Moise and why.
Well, I think they're able to know who the triggermen were, and it appears that it was the Colombians. And we have Martine Moise, who is now recovering from her surgeries in Miami and seems to be offering a lot of clarity on that. She was apparently shot first, and then he was shot. So she might not have seen exactly the trigger man, but it seems it was the Colombians. Who's behind them, who's paying for them? Well, I think for sure it's not this doctor who was practically bankrupt and seems to be a fall guy, a front man. We think that sectors of the bourgeoisie who were at war with Jovenel, feuding with Jovenel, were the intellectual authors and the financial backers of this obviously very expensive and very sophisticated operation.
Right. Monique, I just quickly, are your suspicions about the same as Kim's?
No, they are not. I do not know where he gets his information. All I know is that we don't have in Haiti, what he's saying has not been said. And so I don't know what his sources are. But bottom line, what I want to say is that whoever it is that did this probably has a lot of money and has a lot of power. But in terms of us Haitian people, I think what is important is this is the same, it's the continuation of Jovenel Moise. Jovenel Moise died, and that is an unfortunate event. But bottom line, his policies, this is the prime minister that he had that is still there. And our suffering is still the same. Gangs were fighting it out yesterday. We heard that there were kidnappings. And so the state of terror that Jovenel Moise himself created, Haitians are still suffering from it. And there are whole parts of the country, the whole southern 4 geographical departments that are off limit to Port-au-Prince and Port-au-Prince to them. So the country is still under control of gangs, and these gangs were complicit with Jovenel Moise, and we believe they were practically his mercenaries or his proxies during the last few years. So we are still suffering. Haitians, whoever did this, we need to know. Okay. And we also need to be justice. Okay. But justice for everyone.
Very understandable. But in the meantime, you have Claude Joseph, the interim prime minister, Monique, calling for U.S. troops to help stabilize the situation in Haiti. It is something you are firmly against. Any foreign intervention you seem to think would actually exacerbate Haiti's problems. Why?
Well, because first of all, he has no legitimacy to do this. This is somebody who was fired by Jovenel Moise. The other one was supposed to take over power, in the next, I think the day probably that Jovenel Moise had died. So that is a first situation. The second situation is we do not need troops. The history of Haiti with American troops and with UN troops is a abysmal history. The United States occupied us for close to over 30 years and left problems for us. And a lot of people died. We got nothing positive out of the United States occupation.
Okay.
The UN occupation came, it was the same thing. We need to find a Haitian solution. It's about Haitians sitting down together. It's difficult. It's going to be even more difficult, but that is the solution. That's what we need to do. We cannot have others come with boots on the ground. What is that going to do for us?
Well, let me ask Kim. I mean, do you have the same opinion of any suggestion of foreign intervention? And I want to ask you as well, Kim, whom you think is actually in charge of Haiti right now, and our elections, which we've heard mentioned. Is that even an option at this point to try and help stabilize what government there is?
No, elections aren't going to happen anytime soon. And I totally agree with Monique. The U.S. should not intervene. It's already intervened 3 times in the last century, 1915, 1994, and 2004. And I think it's largely responsible for the debilitated state of the Haitian state today. This is why we're seeing this terrible dysfunction. And I don't think that, there can be anything gained from the U.S. intervening once again. Unfortunately, I think they are planning that despite their so-called reluctance. And I think it will be very important for the Haitian people and the neighbors, the Caribbean community, the Latin American community, to also resist this, because they might not be able to get it through the Security Council, thanks to maybe China's veto, but they may try the OAS or some local coalition of the willing. And I think it's very important to fight that.
Okay. Monique, then, we just have a few minutes left. What ideally does Haiti need now? What could it get that could help bring the kind of stability that's needed for the people whom you've been saying are genuinely suffering?
I think what we need is really a kind of coalition government, or a president and a prime minister that comes out of an agenda of consensus. It has to be civil society in all of its parts to come together with the political leaders, or at least a critical mass of political leaders, to get together, to sit down and say, you know what, this is the way forward. And the 3-year crisis, there were major issues that were being asked for. They have to be addressed. There was social justice, meaning healthcare, education, decent jobs. You have 54% of the Haitian population that is under 24 years old. You need to get them to be involved and participating in the future of Haiti in a sustainable manner. So we need to get together. And the commission that I am part of to find a Haitian solution, that's what we're doing. Yesterday, we had a huge meeting with about 80 people from various civil society and also political organizations. What we're trying to do within the next 2 days is broaden that coalition so that we can bring them together around the table, around the consensus agenda that we have designed based on interviews the 4-month-old commission has been conveying with others. So that is the solution, a consensus political agreement between civil society and political actors. You may not get all of them, but you need a critical mass.
Okay, Kim, very quickly, is it realistic to think that some sense of unity, could come out of this in order to avoid any further dissent Or
Well,
are politicians really going to be pursuing their own interests no matter what?
Well, I think civil society and politicians can try, but some people think these types of problems are based on misunderstandings. They're not. It's class interests. And right now, there is a revolution underway from Haiti's lumpen proletariat in the vast swaths of the shanty towns of Port-au-Prince and other cities, which are armed and getting more organized, and they've had enough. They're saying, we're going to take over the car dealerships, the banks, the grocery stores of the bourgeoisie. They're fed up, and I think that civil society and politicians better take note of this uprising in the shanty towns, or the problems are going to continue.
Well, Kim, I do hope you're
there
wrong.
have been, I just want to mention something. There have been uprisings for the last 3 years. Haiti has been in crisis for the last 3 years. And I just want to be very clear. The agenda has been the massive inequality. It's not only the lumpen proletariat, it's everyone pretty much. There have been millions who have been protesting over the last 3 years over the inequality, the apartheid-like exclusion. So it is not a shantytown issue. It is a Haitian issue, a larger Haitian history in terms of issue in terms of an agenda of getting rid of massive inequality.
Okay.
I wanted to get that on the platform. Sorry about that.
Monique, no problem. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. We are completely out of time for this segment. I'd like to thank really both of my guests so much for being with us, and of course to our viewers for tuning in as well. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.